She said, every time I come down in the mornings from upstairs, I halfway expect to see a murder-suicide in the master bedroom.
Hello, I'm Gretchen Baskerville, the author of The Life-Saving Divorce. Have you ever wondered why a person would get a gray divorce just as they're coming into their retirement years? Well, today I'm interviewing Schari, a committed Christian woman and mother of 3 who escaped an abusive marriage just weeks before her 40th anniversary and is now rebuilding her life. Discover how she married a terrifying and violent man who endangered her and the children physically, emotionally, and financially. It's important that we understand why she stayed, the religious messages that kept her in that destructive marriage, and how finally a wise Christian counselor helped her break through the roadblocks that were keeping her there. In part 2, she tells how the Lord has blessed her, how she regained financial stability and is thriving beyond anything she even dreamed of. Come along as we jump right into this interview. Schari, I'm going to start where I start with everyone, which is tell me a little bit about what you expected when you were a young girl about marriage.
Well, I was deeply, brought up in a deeply religious home, so I expected my marriage to be one marriage only to one man and stay that way till the end of time. And my mother always stayed home, and that is what I, wanted to do, because I remember walking in from school and the kitchen would be warm and good smells coming, from her cooking. And so I wanted that for my children.
Tell me a little bit about how you met your husband-to-be and whether you saw any red flags right away.
Well, I was 17 and he was 4 years older. I had been attending the same church all of my life that I could remember. And we got a new pastor. And he came with that pastor. That pastor had a son that was his age, and they were best friends, and he had been living with them. So he came to Dallas where we lived, and that's how I met him, was at the church. And we started dating pretty soon after he came. He actually sat in my high school graduation audience and saw me graduate. So I graduated in May, and we were engaged by September, and we were married by the next March.
Wow, that's young. How old were you?
18, and he was 22, so yes, very young. But it seemed like, all of my friends back then were getting married in the church I went to. Everyone was getting married around 18, 19 years of age. So it didn't really seem unusual to me then. Now I would be horrified. My daughters did that, but at the time I felt very grown and capable.
I'm in my 60s, and we were expected to carry a lot of responsibility already by that age. So I get that loud and clear. So did you see any red flags in his behavior at that point before the wedding day?
Well, yes, we did have fights, and he would always apologize by sending flowers or something and making promises that he would change. He had a pretty hair trigger temper. He had a job as a manager at a shoe store that he got fired from because he was not doing his work properly. And I remember that he was so angry, he put a hole in the wall of their back room with his fist. So yes, and I knew that he had that bad temper, but he just always apologized, and I thought, it would be okay. That he meant it.
He seemed sincere. He was willing to spend money on flowers. Sure.
Right.
Yeah, completely understandable.
I desperately wanted to get married. I felt like, that was what I was aiming for. And so that was the big thing.
Were you pretty sure about him from the time you met him, or did you have any waffling back and forth?
Actually, I wasn't that crazy about him. Deep down, if I thought about it, I think I just really wanted to get married very badly, and he was available. So I don't remember being wildly, madly in love with him. There was always a reservation about him in my mind.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would say something similar, which is I was in the certain age range and it was my time to get married and everyone else gets married and this is what the life path is supposed to be. And so here he is and we're going to make this work. All right. So, what happened? Tell us a little bit about the wedding and honeymoon. Anything there that we should know about?
Um, well, we got married at the church where I had attended, and he was now attending also, by my long term pastor. We didn't really have a honeymoon. The honeymoon consisted of a trip to Six Flags over Texas the next day. So the truth is, he had lost his job right before we got married. And my father was saying, please don't get married right now. Wait, wait, wait. And his father was saying, just go ahead and get married. I'll cover all your bills until he gets something. And so that's what we did, which
Oh,
turned out
wow.
to be a pretty big mistake because his parents were always very involved financially in our life.
Oh, wow. Could you give us an example? I mean, that's to give someone carte blanche, to give a child carte blanche is really a danger sign. As I've been doing more and more of these interviews, when I hear that a parent is covering the debts for an adult child, I can tell that something in the nature of financial abuse is coming up.
Yes, and that continued throughout our marriage. That they had to put bills for us because he was very irresponsible with money, and he changed careers several times and changed jobs like underwear. I mean, if he came home in the middle of the day, my heart would just sink to my feet because I knew he had been fired or had quit a job.
Hmm.
So it was always asking his parents for money. And, when somebody's giving you money, there's a little control and things like that that go along with that, of course. And so it was not a healthy situation at all.
I get that loud and clear. So tell us about the first incident of abuse, in addition to the financial abuse, that kind of woke you up.
Oh, well, it was a long marriage, so and there were very many. Um, I I don't know that it was the first. It's probably the first I remember being out in the garage with him, and he was a carpenter, and so he had power tools and things like that. And we were fighting over something I don't even know what it was now, but I remember he got very angry at me, and he threw one of his power saws at me. Fortunately, did not hit me with that, but then we had a stack of suitcases that were all inside of each other. He threw that at me and hit me with that, and so that's one of the first things that I remember um, in the marriage.
And what did you do at that point?
I think probably like I did almost every single time, I just shoved it under the rug and carried on. There might be, some silence for a while where we weren't really speaking to one another, but ultimately I could not stand to not be everything to be okay between us, and I would do whatever it took to get things back together.
So you really want to be on good terms with him all the time, even if it meant you apologizing for things you didn't do.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of the things he did were kind of surreal to me. They were so crazy. You couldn't even really wrap your mind around it that it was happening. And if you did accept what really had just happened, you would be forced to leave him or call the police or and I didn't want to do any of that. It threatened my what I felt like my security or my place in the world, and I didn't want to call the police. So I would just find a way to shove it under the rug and carry on.
Right. You had to kind of lie to yourself. This didn't happen, or if it did happen, it's not that big, or maybe I misunderstood it because our identity is being the wife of this person. And by this time, I think you said he was involved with lay leadership at church.
Yes, our whole marriage, he was involved in the church, and so was I in different positions. We taught children's classes together. He was the leader of the boys group at the church. He was a soloist. He was a worship leader at times. He was an elder and deacon at times, and an adult Sunday school teacher. So we were always involved in the church.
So how would you finish this sentence? I can't call the police because
Because of the embarrassment and shame, and not wanting everyone in the church to know what was going on at our house.
got it. The fear of gossip, the shame, the the just the embarrassment.
Right. And I didn't want my parents to know either. I mean, I didn't tell them either.
Wow. So they didn't catch on at all. And it sounds like your dad was a really
kind, loving, sensible man.
I think now that if I had gone to them while he was still alive and told them some of the things that was going on, that they definitely would have been in my corner and helped me, get free. But I thought that my mother would be so disappointed, and I just was embarrassed and ashamed. I didn't want them to know.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. So give us another incident. What happened after that?
Oh, there were, he would just go into rages. And when he was in a rage, you couldn't get through to him. It was like he was, I call it a rage tunnel that he was in. He couldn't see or hear you. It was just, his eyes would be bulging out, his neck veins would be bulging out. It was pretty scary. And so we cycled through that constantly for the whole 40 years of his rages. Um, was more than one time, but he threw a coffee table and hit the ceiling with it and knocked holes in the ceiling and broke furniture and put holes in the walls and doors. He broke numerous phones by throwing them, smashed televisions, lots of just throwing and, things like that. I know one time he snapped like that and he threw furniture and broke it and was smashing, trinkets that were laying around, glassware and things that he smashed. And I remember my youngest child was 16 months at the time. I have 3 children and he was 16 months. And I was very scared. I called his father and mother. They lived in another city about 2 hours away. And they called his brother who lived in my city, and they came rushing over, and he ended up in the mental hospital that night. So he stayed like a day, you know. But I remember I got in the car with my 3 kids, and I took off for my mother's, but I got down the street, and I thought, he's probably going to kill himself. I can't go because I felt responsible for, whether or not he took his life. So I turned around and went back.
Did he often make suicide threats like that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And even one time he took medication and I found the empty bottles and I could tell something was off with him. And so then I went downstairs and figured out that he had taken medications and had to call poison control, who told me to call the paramedics, and he would not go with them. So the police had to be called, and they had I remember them throwing him to the ground and handcuffing him. And one of my children was home at the time and witnessed the whole thing. And they took him to the hospital and, pumped his stomach, and he ended up in the mental hospital.
Wow.
There were 4 or 5 suicide threats or attempts. And I'm going to put attempts in quotes because I don't think he was ever really serious about killing himself. I think it was more a manipulation tactic.
I was going to ask you about that, but I didn't want to bring it up quite that way. But so what was your tip off that you don't think it was real?
Well, I just think he loved himself too much to do that, for one thing. The very last one that I went through with him was when we were separated. And he sent me a very lengthy suicide note in which he said goodbye to each of the children and said things that he remembered about them growing up. And most of it was the bad things that they had done that he brought up, which I found very strange, and they took great offense to. And then, he told me how much he loved me, but at the very beginning of the note, he said, in 2 hours, I'm going to kill myself and my dog, and this is where you will find my body. So it's kind of like, you have 2 hours to call someone and get me help. And he was in another state at the time, and we ended up calling the sheriff in that state, and they had to track him down, and he took him on a police chase, and it was it ended up in the papers before it was over.
Wow. Now, how long did it take for the church you attended and the church leaders to catch on something is really wrong in this marriage?
Well, I would say that during our married life, which was almost 40 years, like 6 weeks being 40 years, that we attended 4 churches throughout that time. The first one was the church I grew up in. And I don't know that I ever went to them with the problems. they knew we struggled with finances and things, but I'm sure that we kept all of that information away from them. Then we went to another church, and that pastor I actually went to in a very big way with the problems. And, he tried to counsel us. And I remember at one point, my husband got so mad at what we were talking about in the office with him that he just got up and left me there. And the pastor had to bring me home from counseling. And on the way, he said to me, Schari, if you wanted to get divorced, pastor would not be upset with you. And at the time, it shocked me so badly. And when I told my husband he had said that, he was furious that he would say that. And for a long time, I thought that was a terrible thing for him to say to me. But looking back now, I think you were absolutely right. And, I should have gone with that. And then the next church we went to, my husband got very chummy with the pastor there. And we had, association with him for several years. But he always, when I went to him, I think one time and tried to talk to him about getting some counseling, he just didn't want to hear it. He was very much in the man's corner. So the last church I went to that actually helped me through my divorce, when I went to them for counseling, I got a counselor there that was fabulous. We had one session together, and it was horrible. And he said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to counsel separate. And at some point, maybe we can bring you back together. But it just went off the rails. And he is the one who actually told me that don't worry, Schari, if you divorce him, if that's what you decide, we will be there with you every step of the way. And I really owe them a lot of gratitude.
So by that time, you were ready for that message. Prior, you hadn't been open to that message, and now you finally were.
Right. And my children were putting pressure on me in that direction, too. They wanted me to leave their father.
Give me an overview on their lives and how they processed it all, and then how they came to you and said, get out.
Well, I have three. My oldest is a daughter, and she's now married and has two little girls. And then I have a middle child who's a daughter also, and she has three children and is in a stable relationship. And then I have my son is my youngest, and he's a Marine veteran. I'm very proud of that.
Congratulations.
Yes, he's, so those are my three. And, a lot of my husband and my arguments were over the children because I thought he was too harsh with them. And we would, I would get between them many times and try to deflect off of them. So that was a lot of our arguing. And my kids remember one time he threw, those big, heavy dictionaries that weigh about 25 pounds. He threw that off of our second floor at my son, hit him in the head.
Oh, wow.
He was about 14. And that was just one example of he and my son went at it pretty good. And, he would try to restrain my children, all kinds of things. I mean, he was pretty harsh with them. They loved him. I mean, it was a very strange thing because in a lot of ways he was a good father. He would bathe them and diaper them when they were little, and he would go to all of their sporting activities and programs. He was very good about those things. And so it's kind of hard for all of us to know how to look at him. It's confusing, but today, none of them have a relationship with him. He hasn't even seen our youngest granddaughter, and she's almost 4. They actually, near the end, my son told me that if I didn't leave his father, that he was going to distance himself from me. He said, because, there's nothing I can do to change it. You have to change it. And he said, I'm just not going to be part of this. And my daughter's very much wanting me to leave him. Also, my daughter told me, Mom, because she lived with me at the time with her little kids, she said, every time I come down in the mornings from upstairs, I halfway expect to see a murder-suicide in the master bedroom.
Oh, wow. And let me go back to something you talked about. How do we see Dad? Because there was a good side of Dad, and there was this really violent, vicious side of Dad. And I think all of us have to, look at it that way. The people are pretty gray. There are people who do some good things in their children's life, but at the same time, there's sort of this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing going back and forth. And so I totally understand children who, genuinely love or genuinely cut off that person, or even change their mind over, different ages and stages in their life. So I understand that completely. Let me ask you about when these things would happen. The books were thrown, the tables were thrown, the equipment was thrown. Did you run and hide? Were you trying to stand and restrain him? What were you doing during these times?
Well, when I was young, I was much more likely to not retreat, to stand my ground. And if he tried to shove me into a corner or push me into a room, I would come back at him and say, don't try to do that. I'm not, you're not going to shove me. But as I got older, I think I got wiser. And I do remember one of the very last incidents at the home while we were still married. The day before, he had gotten into it with our adult daughter, our middle daughter, and he had jerked her down the stairs and injured her, and in the process had actually injured himself. And I had been in the middle. It was a very bad thing. So the next day, I came in from work, and he was sitting there with crutches because he had actually torn a muscle loose in his leg. And I said to him, I think you owe Megan an apology. And he jumped up out of that chair like he'd been shot out of a cannon, and he threw his cell phone against the wall and smashed it. And he took his crutch and he just started beating the television to smithereens. And I remember sitting on the couch as far away as I could get from it and kind of, just trying to shrink down. And so there was a lot of difference in the way I handled it in the beginning of the relationship and how I handled it at the end. I was, I think, more afraid of him at the end. In the beginning and middle, I thought, oh, he would never actually, attack me physically. He might throw things and rage, but as I got older, I realized that I couldn't count on that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what it sounds like. Now, what kind of messages were you getting from various Christian books or Christian preachers, or even from social messages that said you have to stay?
Well, I was raised in a Pentecostal denomination, and of course, you married once and you stayed married unless they passed away. They did think that if there was adultery, you could get divorced unless they wanted to stay with you. If they were willing to stay, you were obligated to stay and try to win them for the Lord. But, adultery was kind of the permission slip out, but nothing else. And I don't guess abuse was really even talked about as whether or not you could leave for that. So I was taught that marriage is for life, and you are faithful, you're loyal, and you do everything you can, to work it out. You pray and you ask God to heal your marriage, and, and also that if you did divorce, you were not allowed to remarry.
So 40-year marriage, what finally were the last straws or the last tipping points for you?
Well, in August of 2015, we started going to the counselor at the church I talked about, and we counseled with him individually. And we did that for about 6 months, trying to put the marriage back together. And my husband continued to lie and be very resistant to what the counselor was trying to do. At one point, the counselor told him any other man who had done the things you have done would be on his third or fourth wife by now. Which really struck my husband. He mentioned that several times to me later, that was like a revelation to him. But so we did that for about 6 months, and then it just became very apparent finally to the counselor that we were dealing with abuse and that my husband was not, willing to change. And so he told me one day, he said, Schari, I think, that you really need to decide if you want to continue this or you want to be divorced. He said, if you want to divorce, we will be there for you,
Hallelujah. Oh.
Because I just kept saying, I don't know what I'll do. And so he told me, he said, why don't you go home today and tell him that you want him to leave for a 4-week trial. And during that time, he needs to decide, if he's willing to go through the long-term process to make changes, and you need to decide if you're willing to go through that. He said, because at the end of that, he may or may not be changed, and you may have spent 2 years and not be any further down the road. And I said, well, that sounds like a good idea, but he will not leave the house. If I ask him to leave, he'll tell me, if you don't like it, you know what you can do. And I said, I have my daughter living there with her 3 children, and I don't want to leave them there with him. And so he said, would you like me to call him and ask him if
Wow.
he will? And he said, I will offer to let him come live in my apartment for 4 weeks. And so I said, sure. So he called him, and my husband had a lot of respect for that man, and he agreed to do it. And so by the time I got home, my husband was gone from the house. And I thought that was going to be good. The very next day, he was calling me and begging to come back, and I told him, no, we're going to do this 4 weeks. And so about a week and a half into it, suddenly one day he just decided that I was going to divorce him. And I had not said I was going to divorce him. I really was waiting to see. And I remember I was at work. It was a Wednesday, and he started calling me, and he just got more and more, crazy. And there was a check involved that he wanted me to sign the whole thing over to him, and it was several $1,000s. And I said, no, I'm not going to sign the whole thing over to you. And it escalated. He told me he was going to kill himself. I had to call the police. And so he was actually in that man's apartment. The police had to go to the apartment, and they took him to the mental hospital. And my son actually had come to the man's apartment also and had retrieved the gun that my husband had for safekeeping. And so, the hospital, the next day, they let him out. And he calls my son to come get him. So my son went to get him, and he gets in the car, and he asked for that gun back. And my son said, no, I'm not going to give you that gun. You just got out of the hospital for threatening to kill yourself with that gun. I'm not going to do it. And he started getting very angry and telling him, you are going to give me that gun. And my son said, no, I'm not. And if you don't hush about it, I'm going to pull the truck over, and you're going to get out. You can walk back to the apartment. And so my husband would not stop. And my son related that he was becoming enraged like he would do. And so my son jerked over to the side of the road or in a parking lot, and he said, open the door, and he said, get out. My husband said, no, I'm not getting out. And so my son got out of the truck and went around and pulled him out. And in the process, my son was a Marine at one point, and he had the barrel off of a 50 cal gun, which is a steel barrel, and it's very heavy. And my husband grabbed that barrel of the gun as he went out the door, and he started attacking my son with it. He damaged the truck. He cut my son's leg with it. At one point, he was trying to bash my son's head into the concrete. He was trying to beat him over the head with that steel gun barrel, and people started gathering and were watching it and filming it. The police were called, but it was 45 minutes before they got there. My son finally got him in a hold and was able to sit and hold him so he couldn't beat him in the head with that. So when I was called, I was at work, and they told me that, I was just horrified. And the very next morning, my middle daughter went with me because she had worked for a company where they did a lot of court work, and she was used to going through the courts and filing paperwork. She went with me, and I filed for divorce and a protection order that very next day, and he was served the day after that at work with divorce papers. And the protection order prevented him from coming back in the house because both our names were on it. And without that, he could have come back in the house and refused to leave. And like I said before, my grandchildren were there, so they needed a home. So the protection order, at that point, it was a temporary order. It was very important to keep him out of the house. And we were so scared that, we changed locks on the doors. My son stayed over with a gun, and we were pretty worried about him. And he actually did stalk me some during our separation. My counselor, he said, Schari, I'm glad you were able to finally say you would leave after he did that to your son. I just wish that you could have done that for yourself.
Oh, but isn't that true? So often we say, I can handle it, but don't touch my children. What went through your mind? Were you in a situation where you were financially stable enough that you thought you could get divorced and that life would be okay? What were your worries and fears?
No, I was not financially secure. My husband had always been very irresponsible with money. Every time I opened the checking, I did all the bills. So every time I opened the checking account, I would hold my breath because I just knew that, the money would be gone on some foolish thing that he had gone behind my back and done. We had no savings or anything like that. And in fact, the last few years of our marriage, he had driven his consulting business into the ground. He just stopped going to work and started playing golf all day long and seeing strippers during the day. And so the business just went away, and he was working, when he did work, he was working minimum wage jobs. And I had gone to work at this point, and, I didn't make a lot of money because I wasn't college educated. So we made bills, and that was about it. There was no money in savings. We had a little bit of equity in the house because at one point our house had gotten so far behind, we actually didn't make payments on the house for 32 months, and somehow they did not foreclose on it, but it just ate all the equity in the house up. So there wasn't very much equity in the house.
So here you were going to walk out the door, and you had nothing to go to. You had no way of supporting yourself.
Right. Well, I actually was going to stay in the house. I had finally gotten a permanent protection order that kept him out of the house, and that was my plan. But the rent and the utilities, I couldn't afford them on my own. So I ended up having to put the house on the market, and it was very damaged because we had some rain and stuff that had damaged it, and the insurance company had paid a lot of money, and he had gotten the checks unbeknownst to me out of the mail and had gone and bought guns and different things with it. And so he didn't repair the house. The house had a lot of work it needed, so I had to buy it. I had to sell to like one of those ugly house people. So I didn't get, what the house was really worth if had it been in decent condition, but.
This is the end of part 1. Click on the link to go to part 2. In part 2, Schari tells us how the Lord has blessed her, how she's regained financial stability and is thriving beyond anything she even dreamed of. Come along as we hear the rest of her story.